Samsthapakaya cha dharmasya sarvadharma swarupini avatara varishtaya Ramakrishnaya te namaha. Good morning, everybody. On this bright and sunny morning, it's nice to see some familiar faces and some new faces as well. I'll be speaking today on an interesting and very current topic, spiritual but not religious, question mark. The question mark is significant as well. We'll see why. There's been a lot of research done recently on this phenomenon called spiritual but not religious. It's become a movement. And there are a number of studies that have been done showing that up to about 30% of Americans identify as spiritual but not religious. It's a range, actually. I mean, if you want to get technical, it's between 17 and 30% about. But it's increasing. The number of people who identify as SBNR, spiritual but not religious, is increasing, especially among the younger generations. In one survey, they found that 72% of millennials, defined as 18 to 29-year-olds, consider themselves to be more spiritual than religious. So this is a growing movement. And I want to explore this phenomenon. So what do SBNRs, let's use this acronym for now, otherwise it's going to become very long-winded repeating it. So SBNRs, spiritual but not religious people who identify as spiritual but not religious. They all have three things in common, it seems to me. The first is they're disenchanted with traditional religion, institutional religion, religious fundamentalism. This is common across almost everybody who identifies as SBNR. Second, another commonality, but they have a spiritual hunger. They're not atheistic, they're open to spirituality, but they're disgusted with religious hypocrisy, with religious fundamentalism. And the third is, and this is, I don't want to say it's universal among SBNRs, but you find it frequently, they're often deeply interested in and open to Eastern religions. That could be Hinduism, Vedanta, Buddhism, Taoism, Native American spirituality, you name it. But they're able to think outside the box spiritually and religiously. Now, before I get into more details about this movement and the philosophical dimensions of the movement, strengths and weaknesses of the movement, I wanted to address a different question briefly. When did the phrase spiritual but not religious first become popular? And how did it become popular? And the reason why I want to mention this is because there's a very interesting connection with the very place we're all standing in or sitting here today. Trabuco Canyon, Ramakrishna Monastery. What is the connection? Please bear with me. I'll draw a link here. First of all, how many of you are familiar with Gerald Hurd? Good, yeah, a few of you are. He's the one who founded this place, which at the time was founded as Trabuco College. In 1941, with his own funds, built in 1942. And Gerald Hurd learned about Vedanta, he studied Vedanta, practiced Vedanta under the guidance of Swami Prabhavanandaji, who was the founding head Swami of the Hollywood Center, Vedanta Society of Southern California in Hollywood, where I'm currently based. Now, so that was 1942 when it was built. 7 years later, the college closed down for various reasons. And he donated Trabuco College to Prabhavanandaji's society. And then it got renamed, Prabhavanandaji renamed it the Ramakrishna Monastery. But while it was Trabuco College in the 1940s, many great intellectuals and spiritual aspirants came to study spirituality with Hurd, under Hurd, and to meet other spiritual aspirants and so on. One of these sincere spiritual aspirants was a co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, Bill Wilson. He met Gerald Hurd here in Trabuco in the 1940s and had a lifelong friendship with him. And because Gerald Hurd was a Vedantin and a very sincere practitioner of Vedanta, he taught Bill W. Vedanta as he was starting to think about developing this Alcoholics Anonymous program, the 12 steps, the underlying philosophy. So Bill W., under the influence of Gerald Hurd, was strongly influenced by Vedanta, and it would take an entirely different lecture to explore in detail the tacit Vedantic underpinnings of the Alcoholics Anonymous movement, but I think it would be a very interesting and important lecture. But to come to the point, William Parsons, he's a scholar who edited a scholarly volume a few years ago in 2018 called Being Spiritual But Not Religious. And in his introduction to this book, he asked this question: when did the SBNR phrase, spiritual but not religious, first become widely known, widely used? And this is what he has to say. Page 18 of this book. It was Bill Wilson, Bill W., as he is usually referred to, and his 12-step Alcoholics Anonymous program that most successfully disseminated the phrase into popular parlance. Bill W. referred to AA as, quote, not religious but spiritual, as early as 1940. This is a continuation of this quote from Parsons. He later described, so Bill W. later described AA as, quote, a spiritual rather than a religious program. Okay? So it's very interesting, and that's why I thought this would be an especially appropriate topic here in Trabuco Canyon. Now, for the remainder of this lecture, I want to address three main questions. The first, why is it that more and more people are identifying as spiritual but not religious? Not just in the US, but especially in the US. Second, how would Swami Vivekananda have reacted to the SBNR movement? This is a kind of speculative question. He's not here to tell us. But it's, I think, an interesting question to ask. And this is going to take the majority of the time in this lecture today. I'm going to spend most of the lecture exploring the SBNR movement from the standpoint of Vedanta. And specifically ask, from Swami Vivekananda's standpoint of Vedanta, what are the strengths of the SBNR movement? And what are the weaknesses and maybe potential pitfalls or dangers of the SBNR movement? And third and finally, I want to address briefly, what is the future of the SBNR movement? How might it evolve, if at all? So, first question. So these three questions, that's my attempt, my goal. First question, why are more and more people identifying as SBNR? I've already mentioned some of these, but one of the main reasons I think is that more and more people are becoming very legitimately disenchanted with traditional religion for all sorts of reasons, and I'll just mention a few. First, the rise of science. Charles Darwin's evolutionary theory, many other scientific theories make it much harder for contemporary people to swallow some traditional religious doctrines. To give you one simple example, creationism, which is not accepted by all Christians, but by some, especially more fundamentalist Christians. It's very difficult to accept creationism while also accepting modern scientific theories like evolutionary theory. But there are many other examples. I'm sure you have your own examples of this. But the rise of science and critical thinking is one of the reasons, I think, why more and more people are moving away from traditional religion and identifying as spiritual but not religious. Second reason is one I already mentioned too, which is that they're fed up with religious fundamentalism. Every day we hear about religious violence and killing committed in the name of religion. And people are just disgusted. If this is the result of religion, I don't want to be religious. Right? And that's justified. Or at least to some extent it's justified. And they see efforts throughout the world still, there are missionaries going out to different countries trying to convert people from one religion to another. There's so much ego involved in all of this. Ego and violence, a lack of openness to other people's ideas. And these people who identify as SBNR also tend to be disgusted with religious hypocrisy. This is also on the rise. And they find that people who talk big about religion may not be leading very spiritual lives. And I mean, I don't need to go into specifics here, but there's all sorts of corruption and abuse and all sorts of stuff happening in different religious organizations. And they're seeing it. They're covered in the news. And so what will people think? If this is what it means to be a priest or to be a monk or whoever, then I don't want to be a priest or a monk. I don't want to be religious at all. So it's a kind of reaction to what they see as the deep problems with traditional institutional religion, I think. And at the same time, they don't want to go in the opposite direction of a kind of Richard Dawkins. Some of you have probably heard of him. He's a professor at Oxford, a biologist, but who's written books attacking religion. He's got a book called The God Delusion, and he claims that religion has to be false, and Charles Darwin's evolutionary theory has proved religion to be false, and so on and so forth. And so, but people who identify as SBNR, it's not that they're atheists. I think they recognize that atheism is just as dogmatic as fundamentalist religion in some ways. Prove that God doesn't exist. Good luck, actually. It's not very easy to prove that God doesn't exist. So they have a spiritual yearning. They have a spiritual hunger. They may not even believe in God, but that they still have this genuine spiritual longing, desire, interest. So that's with regard to the first question, why are more and more people identifying as SBNR? I think there are very legitimate reasons. And I think we should understand what those reasons are. At the same time, later in the lecture, I will talk about some of the kind of dangers and pitfalls of the SBNR movement, but that's not to detract from all the positive. Second, the second big question, actually I'm going to split into two sub-questions. The first sub-question is, what are the connections between Swami Vivekananda's philosophy of Vedanta and the contemporary SBNR movement? That's the first question. Second question, how might Swami Vivekananda have reacted to the SBNR movement? So let's look at the first sub-question first. What are some of the connections between Vivekananda's Vedanta and SBNR, this SBNR movement? Interestingly, in an 1896 interview in London, Vivekananda himself, at that time, over 30 years ago almost, he noticed this phenomenon at that time. So let me read out from this interview. He says, "The world of thought is being converted. We are only at the beginning as yet. The number of those who decline to adopt any special form of religion is greatly increasing. And this movement is among the educated classes. In a recent American census, a large number of persons declined to class themselves as belonging to any form of religion. All religions are different expressions of the same truth. All march on or die out. They are the radii of the same truth, the expression that variety of minds requires." And then the interviewer says, he's getting excited, the interviewer, and he says, "Now we are getting near it. What is that central truth?" And then Vivekananda says, "The divine within. Every being, however degraded, is the expression of the divine." So this is really fascinating. He's talking about an American census from 1896, and he's noticing that more and more Americans were identifying as SBNR at that time, and now that phenomenon has multiplied exponentially, and far more people are becoming SBNR, but he had his finger on the pulse even at that time. And he recognized that these people are ready for Vedanta. So he recognized that many Westerners were becoming disenchanted with traditional religion, and what that meant at that time was Christianity. And still, to some extent. But they still have a spiritual hunger, and they're open, and they're hungry for religion. Well, at least for spirituality. And he felt that Vedanta is the perfect thing for these people. And he pitched Vedanta in exactly this way. That's part of the reason why he made such a huge impact in the West, actually. At the same time, he wasn't fully on board with this SBNR thing. And that's clear too, and I want to kind of clarify that a little bit. But he parted ways with his contemporary SBNR people in insisting that being a Vedantin is strictly compatible with being religious. If we accept Vedanta, we can be spiritual and religious. We don't have to see spirituality and religion as contradictory, as a dichotomy, but we can be spiritual and religious at the same time. Okay? And I'm going to try to develop that idea a little bit. So according to Swamiji, what is Vedanta? So this is a big question. According to Swami Vivekananda, Vedanta is not a religion among other religions, but it's the underlying philosophical basis of all religions. Where does he say it? I'll give you one example. This is from another interview he gave in 1896 in London. He says, Vedanta is really the philosophy of religion, the kernel of all its outward forms. All forms of religion have an essential and a non-essential part. If we strip from them the latter, there remains the real basis of all religion, which all forms of religion possess in common. Unity is behind them all. We may call it God, Allah, Jehovah, the Spirit, love. It is the same unity that animates all life, from its lowest form to its noblest manifestation in man. It is on this unity that we need to lay stress. Whereas in the West, and indeed everywhere, it is on the non-essential that men are apt to lay stress. Notice that Swami Vivekananda, he's not contrasting religion with spirituality. He's contrasting the essential and non-essential dimensions of religion. And the essential element of all religions is its spiritual core. And that's what he's calling Vedanta. Okay? So in contemporary parlance, most of you know that Mark Zuckerberg has renamed Facebook Meta, right? And that's the big thing now, metaverse. So if we want, we can think about Vedanta not as a religion, but as a meta-religion. The underlying philosophical basis of all religions. And he explains very clearly what he means by Vedanta as a meta-religion in the epigraph to his book Raja Yoga. This epigraph consists of what I would call 4 Mahamantras, 4 great sayings. Many of you are probably familiar with them, but I'll just read them out to you and then try to unpack them one by one. Number 1, each soul is potentially divine. 2, the goal is to manifest this divinity within by controlling nature, external and internal. 3, do this either by work or worship or psychic control or philosophy, by one or more or all of these, and be free. Work corresponds to karma yoga, worship bhakti yoga, psychic control Raja yoga, philosophy jnana yoga. By one or more or all of these yogas, and be free. 4th, this is the whole of religion. Doctrines or dogmas or rituals or books or temples or forms are but secondary details. So let's unpack these one by one. So first, each soul is potentially divine. Notice every word is important. He's being deliberately open. He's not taking a very specific stand on the exact sense in which the soul is divine. Each soul is potentially divine, and there's a good reason for it. He doesn't want to say anything that's going to commit him to some particular sectarian view. Instead, he wants to accommodate many different spiritual philosophies, many different religious views. And this is very much in line with his guru, Sri Ramakrishna. Sri Ramakrishna used to teach Brahman and Shakti are inseparable. Brahman is non-dual pure consciousness. It's the impersonal aspect of God. And Shakti is the personal aspect, the personal dimension of the same infinite divine reality. Swami Vivekananda used to teach the same thing. He said that our religion preaches an impersonal, personal God. An impersonal, personal God. Okay? And in another place, Swami Vivekananda used to say, for if there is one common doctrine that runs through all our apparently fighting and contradictory sects, it is that all glory, power, and purity are within the soul already. Only, according to Ramanuja, the soul contracts and expands at times. And according to Shankara, it comes under a delusion. Never mind these differences. All admit the truth that the power is there. Potential or manifest, it is there. And the sooner you believe that, the better for you. So he's noting that different schools of Vedanta, different spiritual philosophies may have different understandings of exactly how God relates to the soul. According to Shankara, the soul is actually identical with God. because both God and the soul are at bottom nothing but non-dual pure consciousness. Ramanuja says the soul is a portion of the divinity, of the divine. And that soul is not already identical with God, but expands and contracts. In a state of ignorance, it's in a state of contraction. In the state of knowledge of God, it expands to its full manifestation. And Swami Vivekananda says, let's not highlight and emphasize and obsess so much about the differences, these doctrinal disputes. Notice that the language, each soul is potentially divine. That can accommodate Shankara just as much as it accommodates Ramanuja, just as much as it accommodates Christianity or Islam or Hinduism. That was deliberate. Be as broad as possible in defining the nature of the divine and the soul's relation to the divine. That's the first tenet, the first of the four key tenets of Vedanta. The divine can be impersonal, it can be personal, it can have any kind of form, it can be formless. Second statement, reminding you, the goal is to manifest this divinity within by controlling nature, external and internal. The goal of every religion is to realize God. We can call it, there are many names for it, call it self-realization, call it enlightenment, illumination, nirvana, but it's the same idea. But how does Swami Vivekananda cash it out? The goal of religion is to manifest our innate divinity. That's the second key statement. You might ask, well, what about that last phrase, by controlling nature, external and internal? It seems very kind of almost technical. That's because of the context. Remember, this is an epigraph to Raja Yoga. He pulled it out of his commentary on Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. Okay? And so we have to understand something about Patanjali's metaphysics. According to Patanjali's school, it's based on Sankhya metaphysics. Both the physical body and our minds are insentient. They belong to nature. And nature is insentient. It's called Prakriti in Sanskrit. Which is very startling to some Westerners when they hear that the mind is insentient. What could it mean that the mind is insentient? The mind is also a subtle form of matter, according to not just Sankhya and Yoga, but also according to Vedanta, actually. But then we say, well, the mind is thinking thoughts and is conscious. No, it's the soul that's conscious. And by mistake, we're identifying ourselves with the mind, and we think that the mind is conscious, but the mind isn't conscious. The soul is illuminating the mind with consciousness. Okay, so that's the basic idea. So now, with that in the background, what Swamiji means by external nature is the physical body. And what he means by internal nature is the mind. That's why the subtitle of the book Raja Yoga is Conquering the Internal Nature. Because Raja Yoga, Patanjali's yoga, is based on conquering the mind. Yoga is Chitta Vritti Nirodha, restraining the mental modifications. So that's what Swamiji means. Controlling nature, external and internal, means by controlling the body, the physical body, but by also, more importantly, controlling the mind. Restraining the mind, self-control. What does he mean in simple English? We have to purify ourselves. We have to try to reduce, attenuate, and ultimately eliminate worldly desires and attachments, and thereby transforming ourselves through spiritual practice. What are these spiritual practices? He explains them in the third Mahamantra, the third great saying. Do this either by work, karma yoga, or worship, bhakti yoga, or psychic control, or meditation, Raja Yoga, Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, or philosophy, Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, intellectual reasoning, vichara. By one or more or all of these, this is a very significant qualification. You can do it by any one of these four yogas, by a combination of one or more of the yogas, or by all four of the yogas, and be free. Now, one thing to keep in mind is, notice the language here again, it's very broad. He's not saying Jnana Yoga means Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. He says philosophy. So it means the path of intellectual reasoning. Any spiritual or religious path that involves intellectual reasoning can count as the path of knowledge or philosophy. Psychic control. He's not limiting it to just Patanjali's very specific kind of Yoga Sutra philosophy. Anything that involves control of the mind can count, right? So he's being very, very broad on purpose. Worship. A Christian can worship just as much as a Muslim, and just as much as a Jew, just as much as a Hindu, right? So he's not defining these yogas in a narrowly Hindu way. He's defining them in a very universal way so that they can apply to all of the religions. And we'll see in a second more specifically what he means by that. The key is that he taught the harmony of all the world religions on the basis of this doctrine. by one or more of these 4 yogas, attain the goal of life, which is God realization, enlightenment. What he says is, the argument proceeds in 2 steps. Number 1, every world religion corresponds to one or more of the 4 yogas. If you study any religion, you'll find that there's a kind of predominant emphasis either on devotion toward a personal God, or on active service of some sort, or unattached action, or mental control, psychic control, or it's very philosophical, or some combination. It doesn't have to be that it represents only one yoga. It could be more than one yoga. But this is a very, very important insight that Vivekananda had. Every one of the world religions corresponds to one or more of the 4 yogas. And the second step in his argument, or it's really the conclusion of the argument, therefore every world religion is a direct path to enlightenment. So the first premise is that any one of these yogas can give us enlightenment. Second premise, every world religion corresponds to one or more of these yogas. Therefore, any one of these world religions can take us to the highest goal, the highest spiritual goal of awakening, of illumination, of enlightenment. But he also went further than that. Swami Vivekananda, I discussed this in detail in my book, Swami Vivekananda's Vedantic Cosmopolitanism. I use the phrase religious cosmopolitanism. And what I mean by that is Swami Vivekananda often taught that we can and should actively learn from religions other than our own. We'll be grounded firmly in one religion, but we'll also try to learn from other religions and expose ourselves to other religions and actively try to incorporate aspects of other religious traditions into our own. Okay? And the logic behind that is that every religion has something to teach us. Why? Because each religion corresponds to one of the yogas, and the ideal human being is the one who can combine all 4 yogas to the best of his or her ability. And the 4th statement that Swami Vivekananda makes, the 4th Mahavakya, great saying, let me remind you again, this is the whole of religion. Doctrines or dogmas or rituals or books or temples or forms are but secondary details. So Swami Vivekananda was well aware that different religions differ at the level of doctrine. They disagree on all sorts of things. One question, simple example. Did Christ die on the cross? You might think, well, yeah, of course he died on the cross, but not everybody believes that. Muslims don't believe that Christ died on the cross. In the Quran, that's not accepted. But of course, the Bible accepts it, for instance. That's an example of a conflict at the level of doctrine between different religions. Is rebirth true? Are we reborn? Orthodox Abrahamic religions say no. Hinduism and Buddhism say yes, right? So there's all sorts of conflicts. What does Vivekananda say about these doctrinal disputes across the world religions? He says doctrines are secondary details. Not that they're completely unimportant, but they're not the be-all, end-all. They belong to the non-essential side of religion. What's more, even if some religions are wrong about something, so look, the example of Christ, whether Christ died on the cross. One of those religions is wrong. Either Islam is wrong that Christ didn't die on the cross, or Christianity is wrong. Right? So there had to have been a historical fact of the matter. What Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda say is, even the errors in a religion don't substantially detract from their ability to lead to the highest goal. That's the important thing. And Sri Ramakrishna used to use a wonderful example. He said, imagining that people, wear watches. He said, everybody thinks his or her own watch is right. My watch tells the exactly perfect time. And he says, but no watch tells the exactly correct time. But everybody's watch is good enough to get the job done. Even if you're off by a few seconds or a minute even, nobody's going to kill you for, It still gets the job done. You're able to get to where you need to go on time and this and that. That's the idea. In spite of its doctrinal mistakes, and every religion has some mistakes, it can still be an effective path to salvation or enlightenment, whatever you want to call it. So, to sum up very briefly, what is Vedanta according to Swami Vivekananda? What is this meta-religion of Vedanta? Let me just give 6. Of course, he gave the 4. I'm just going to unpack it a little more. So 6 things briefly. 1, the infinite divine reality is not only the impersonal, non-dual, pure consciousness of Advaita Vedanta, some schools of Buddhism, but also the personal God, which Sri Ramakrishna and Vivekananda used to call Shakti, which manifests in countless forms. Manifests as Kali, manifests as Christ, manifests as Krishna, and so on and so forth. Allah. Allah is not a form. He's formless but personal. But that too is an aspect of the same personal dimension of the divine. Second key tenet of Vedanta. The goal of life is to realize the infinite divine reality in any form or aspect. And there's no higher or lower. Not everybody has to realize pure consciousness, for instance. That's to give you one example. And not everybody has to realize God is Christ or God the Father. Not everybody has to realize God is Allah. But everybody has to realize God, ultimately. That's the goal of life. God, understood in this very broad way, as the infinite divine reality, which is personal in one aspect and impersonal in another. Third key tenet of Vedanta, any one of the four yogas can lead us to the realization of some form or aspect of the divine. Fourth, every world religion corresponds to one of these four yogas. Fifth, therefore every religion is equally capable of taking us to the goal of enlightenment or spiritual realization. And sixth, we can make more rapid spiritual progress, we can enrich our spiritual lives by learning from religions other than our own. That's what I've been calling religious cosmopolitanism. So keep these in the back of our minds as we continue now. So now, coming back to this question of this contemporary SBNR movement, spiritual but not religious movement, what I would say, this is my take on it, is that Swami Vivekananda's Vedanta philosophy is best characterized not as SBNR, but as SBAR. Not spiritual but not religious, but spiritual but also religious. He says this very clearly in an 1897 interview given in London. He says, the Vedanta is the rationale of all religions. Without the Vedanta, every religion is superstition. With it, everything becomes religion. Without the Vedanta, every religion is superstition. With Vedanta, everything becomes religion. It's a very beautiful statement. So Vedanta here is not a religion among other religions, it's a meta-religion which validates all the world's religions. It doesn't invalidate them. This is what we'll find eventually is one of the pitfalls or one of the weaknesses of the SBNR movement. I think they're too quick to assume that if I'm spiritual, then I can't be religious. Vedanta says you can be, if you're truly spiritual, you'll most likely also be religious. And there's absolutely no contradiction between spirituality and religion. So I think what Swami Vivekananda envisioned is that people would accept Vedanta as their meta-religion, as their underlying philosophy, their kind of spiritual philosophy, while at the same time practicing any religion of their choice. They obviously don't have to be Hindu, they can practice any religion they want, but with Vedanta in the background as their kind of underlying philosophical framework. That's what I think he had in mind. He says, for instance, in one of his great speeches at the World's Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893, he says, "Do I wish that the Christian would become Hindu? God forbid. Do I wish that the Hindu or Buddhist would become Christian? God forbid." He wanted Christians to become better Christians, Hindus to be better Hindus, Muslims to be better Muslims. How do they become better? By accepting Vedanta. And again, I don't want you to, so again, if Vedanta were a religion, then he'd be just another proselytizer and trying to convert people, but that's not the idea. Vedanta is a meta-religion. It's a meta-philosophy that validates all of the world religions. In Hinduism and in Vedanta, there's a very important doctrine called Ishta Devata, which means the chosen deity. The idea is that because God is infinite and God manifests in so many different forms, each one of us is free to think of God and to worship God and to meditate on God in the form that we love, that in the form that we prefer, based on our tendencies, what we did in previous lives, right? So if I like to think of God as Christ, then that's perfectly fine. If I like to think of God as Allah, then that's also fine. There's no higher and lower. There's no, this is ultimately true. This is a lower idea than this. Nothing like that. So that's a very important thing to keep in the background. So what does it mean for a Christian to be a Vedantin or a Buddhist to be a Vedantin? It means that so imagine a Christian who loves to think of God as God the Father and to worship Christ as an incarnation. Now, one thing that's important is if you're a Vedantic Christian, you can't say, like Orthodox Christians, that God only incarnates once and for all as Christ, because again, that's limiting God. So Vedanta would say, of course Christ is God, but God can also manifest in other human beings, can and has manifested in other human beings. So it's a kind of, Vedanta forces you to kind of expand your worldview a little bit. it might make you uncomfortable, but that's part of the point, is that it opens you, it makes you more generous toward other religions and toward other viewpoints. And again, what does it mean to keep Vedanta in the background as you practice your own religion? Keep in mind that the goal of your religion, whatever that religion is, whether it's Christianity or Islam or Hinduism, is God realization or enlightenment or self-realization, whatever you want to call it, salvation. Never lose sight of the goal of religion. I think what happens in many cases is that you get so caught up in what Swami Vivekananda used to call the secondary details, the doctrines, fighting with people, that you lose sight of the goal, which is enlightenment. And the third, if you're a Vedantin while also practicing religion, you'll always be actively trying to learn from other religions. That spirit of openness is always there. So, let me be a little bit more concrete. Imagine a Vedantic Christian. Let's say I'm a Vedantic Christian. I accept the Bible, I worship Christ as God, but I also believe that God can incarnate in other human beings, as Krishna, as Ramakrishna possibly. And so I'll never limit God to just Christ. Okay? And also, for instance, actually, if you adopt a kind of Vedantic framework, it can shed new light on many of the great teachings of Jesus. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. This is pure Vedanta, because it focuses on the essence of Christianity. What does Jesus teach us? He says that the aim of Christianity is love of God, God realization. How do you achieve that aim? By purifying your hearts through spiritual practice. And if she's a Vedantic Christian, if I'm a Vedantic Christian, I'll also actively try to learn from non-Christian religions. What do they have to teach me? Because every religion has some unique insights which you don't find in your own home religion. Because every religion corresponds to one or more of the four yogas. Now, coming to the second sub-question, how might Swami Vivekananda have reacted to the contemporary SBNR movement? Imagine, I don't know how many, I'm going to reveal my age indirectly here, but one of my favorite movies growing up as a kid was Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. And so imagine Swami Vivekananda, he was taking this time machine and he comes in 2022 and he's observing this SBNR movement. How might he have reacted? How might he have responded to it? I think first of all, he would have been very encouraging, very sympathetic, and said that it's wonderful. Here are the wonderful points behind the SBNR movement. I'll just mention three. People who identify as SBNR are very open to spirituality. And so they're not dogmatic in the other direction, the way that like Richard Dawkins type people are. They're dogmatic atheists no, they're open. There's a kind of spirit of openness, intellectual openness, spiritual openness. Second plus point, they have a spiritual hunger. There's a sincerity at bottom there. And thirdly, I think Vivekananda was one of the, you can see this in his lectures, he could be scathing sometimes in attacking religious fundamentalism, religious bigotry, religious violence. And so he says, you SBNRs, you're absolutely right in condemning these things, these phenomena. Violence in the name of religion, hatred in the name of religion, bigotry in the name of religion. He says, that's right. That impulse is right to kind of feel that this religion is going in the wrong direction if you're moving toward dogmatism and fanaticism and fundamentalism. But I think he would also say, it's good. You're at a good place, but you can evolve a little bit further. And I think this is how he would make constructive suggestions to people who identify as spiritual but not religious. I think he would have identified, or maybe instead of trying to put words in his mouth, I'll just say, from Swami Vivekananda's Vedantic standpoint, I would try to identify four maybe dangers in the SBNR movement. First, this is a little controversial, but remember the term is spiritual but not religious. I think it's a little bit presumptuous to call ourselves spiritual. What do I mean by that? Spirituality is an achievement. To be truly spiritual means you identify with spirit rather than with the body-mind. And how many of us can truly say that we've identified with the soul? I'm not the body, I'm not the mind. If somebody punches you in the face, I don't feel pain. Can you really say that? Only then are you really spiritual. So I think that from a Vedantic standpoint, it would be more accurate and more humble to call ourselves not spiritual, but spiritual aspirants. We're aspiring to become spiritual. So this is a kind of a slight, almost like a terminological quibble, but I think it's important nonetheless. Imagine if somebody, this is common more and more, but if somebody says, I'm very spiritual, I would roll my eyes, It's a little bit pretentious to call yourself spiritual. But but I'm a spiritual aspirant. You see, there's a humility in that. Okay, but there are more substantive issues that I want to raise as well. Number two, this is a more serious issue. I think that people who identify as spiritual but not religious have an unduly narrow understanding of religion. They identify religion, they equate religion with the worst forms of religion, which is not really fair, it seems to me. They equate religion with religious fundamentalism, with institutional religion. All that's bad in the world religions. Dogmatism, fanaticism, violence, corruption, abuse, blind faith, hypocrisy, stupidity, vulgarity. But is that all there is in religion? What if we defined religion? What about the great saints in religion? The wonderful souls who are completely egoless. What about the St. Francis's and the Mother Teresa's and the Ramakrishnas and the Buddhas? What happened to them? Are they not religious? So that's one thing that I think is important, is that if we expand our understanding of what religion means, we don't have to see religion as opposed to spirituality. I think that's something that Swami Vivekananda himself often emphasized. Let me give you one example from an 1896 lecture. He says, religion permeates the whole of man's life, not only the present, but the past, present, and future. Religion is therefore the eternal relation between the eternal soul and the eternal God. Now comes the question, can religion really accomplish anything? It can. It brings to man eternal life. It has made man what he is and will make of this human animal a god. That is what religion can do. Take religion from human society and what will remain? Nothing but a forest of brutes. So Swami Vivekananda never shied away from the term religion, but he defined it in a very different way from the way that many people, especially people who identify as SBNR, understand religion. Okay, how does he define it? Now this, I think, is really brilliant on his part. I think he's going back to the etymological meaning of the term religion, the English term religion, which goes back to the Latin term religare, which means rebinding. Religion in its etymological sense means anything that reconnects the soul with God, the soul with the divine. And what is the closest Sanskrit term to this meaning of religion in its etymological sense? Yoga. Yoga. That's literally what yoga means. It means connection. It means connecting the soul with God by any of the four yogas. So all the yogas are different forms of religion, actually. So from Swami Vivekananda's standpoint, if we define religion as yoga, then we're not going to find any contradiction between religion and spirituality. It becomes a kind of spiritual technology. It becomes the essence of spiritual practice. The means by which we become spiritual is religion. Third point I want to make, from a Vedantic standpoint, and this directly follows from the second point, the term spiritual but not religious, it presupposes a false dichotomy between spiritual and religious. The assumption is that spirituality and religion are opposites. But for Swami Vivekananda, his approaches, the Vedantic approaches, the essence of all religions is spirituality. So religion is not opposed to spirituality. The essence, the core of all religions is spirituality. What does he mean by spirituality? The innate divinity of every human being. And the fourth point, this is concerning that last phrase, spiritual but not religious, not religious. I think Swami Vivekananda would have said that this is throwing out the baby with the bathwater. And there are dangers here. I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. It's almost violent in rejecting religion. And arguably, and of course it depends, there are more and less sincere SBNR people, and I don't want to kind of make sweeping generalizations here. But as I said, one danger in the SBNR movement is that some people want to have their spiritual cake without doing spiritual practice. So it's a way of kind of justifying laziness and a spiritual laziness, I'm spiritual. I'm already spiritual. That's, again, is a kind of presumptuous idea. I'm spiritual, but I don't need any of these traditions. I don't need to go to church. I don't need to do any spiritual practice. I'm fine just the way I am. I love myself. This kind of this self-love sort of movement. There's a danger of narcissism in this. It becomes a religion of one. In fact, one common criticism of the SBNR movement from traditional religions is what they call Sheilaism. Sheilaism, Sheila, is the name of a woman named Sheila. This is like in the 80s or 90s. She was interviewed and she was asked about her religion. She said, I don't go to church. I don't belong to any religion, but I believe in God. And you know what I practice? I practice Sheilaism. I practice my own religion. And so what happened is that people who belong to like an actual traditional religion, they pounced on this and said, see, the SBNR movement leads to Sheilaism. These narcissistic people who create their own religion without actually doing any spiritual practice, without trying to humble themselves before any higher reality. So anyway, that's the danger. It's this danger of narcissism, complacency. And as I said, there's something a little violent, a little polemical in saying spiritual but not religious. I'm not that. No, there's a more generous attitude to be had toward religion, I think. So I think the more mature attitude that I think Vedanta adopts is that spirituality and religion are dependent on each other. They need each other to thrive. They're mutually interdependent and mutually corrective. They correct for each other's dangers and excesses. What do I mean? Religion without spirituality degenerates easily into fundamentalism, into dogmatism. Right? And spirituality without religion can degenerate into superficiality, into laziness, into narcissism, into complacency, and egoism of a sort. I don't need anybody or anyone, or I don't care for any, I'm just following, my own religion. Now, finally, as I promised, I wanted to cover one more question briefly. What's the future of the SBNR movement? Well, I've kind of already hinted at it, but I think Swami Vivekananda would have deeply sympathized